Hey everyone, it's Miss Payne again, and today we're going to start a new unit called the number system. Our first lesson is going to be dividing fractions by fractions, and on today's agenda we have a pre-test to start with, a PowerPoint where we will do vocabulary words and notes, a worksheet where we're going to go over a homework assignment, and we have an exit slip to wrap up the class. First we're going to go over our objectives and essential questions. So our first objective is that students will be able to compute quotients of fractions after completing guided notes and an exit slip with 80% accuracy. Our second is that students will be able to solve word problems involving dividing fractions by fractions after completing a homework worksheet with 75% accuracy. Some essential questions we have for this lesson are: what is one example of a situation in real life where you will use the division of fractions? How does dividing fractions relate to subtracting fractions? And how can using the keep, change, flip method make dividing fractions easier? So we're first going to start off by taking a pre-test, but I do not want you to worry about it. It is not worth a grade. This test is just to show me what you already know and what we need to work on more throughout our lesson. So in the first section we have 10 vocabulary words that you're going to define the best as you can. In the second one, we have like a series of problems that you need to solve. Some involve dividing fractions, long division, using the standard algorithm to solve multi-digit numbers, or we have decimals in there as well. We have problems with absolute value and finding the difference between two numbers. In the third section, we are going to use diagrams to solve and explain the following problems, which include factors, greatest common factors, and distributive properties. In the fourth section, we are going to solve word problems. These deal with absolute value, sea level, and degrees. And in section 5, we have 3 problems with graphing and number lines. So the first question, you're just going to plot those points on the graph. The second one is with a number line, and the third is you're just finding the distance between points on a graph. So that's it for the pretest. I want you to try your best, take it serious, but don't worry about it because it's not worth a grade. So once you've taken about 10-15 minutes to do the pretest, we're going to do a vocabulary sheet, but we're going to do this throughout the lesson, and it is not worth a grade. This is for your own use, for reference on homework or worksheets. And it's just a vocabulary sheet where you're going to fill in the definitions on these lines. And our vocab words for this lesson are numerator, product, denominator, quotient, mixed number, reciprocal, improper fraction, and equivalent. So as we go throughout our PowerPoint, you're just going to fill in these as much as you can. You can get the answers from other people, you can ask questions throughout the lesson, or you can just copy them directly off of the PowerPoint. Either way, just fill it out, and you do not have to turn it in. It is not worth a grade. The next thing I want to go over is our note sheet. So I created this note sheet for your own use. This is, again, not a grade. I broke it down into section and things to remember. So in this part, you'll see that I have the sections, and these are the sections that are in our PowerPoint later for our notes. So I broke it down into sections so you can have a little bit more room to write down as much as you want to. You can draw diagrams, you can draw pictures, you can write bullet points or paragraph points, whatever you want to do that will help you remember what we're learning about. So, as you can see, we have about 8 sections right here, 7 or 8 sections. As we go through our notes, I want you to write down things you need to remember so that whenever you go to do your worksheet or your homework and you have a question, you can look back on this and try to remember it before you ask me or another peer. So, you're just going to fill this out as we go on. You're not turning it in, you're just going to use it as reference later. So, to start off this unit, our first lesson is going to be learning how to divide a fraction by another fraction. It's not as scary as it sounds, so let's go ahead and get started. So, before we start into the actual process of the new content, we're going to do a review real quick of repetitive subtraction. So, we're going to remind ourselves how repetitive subtraction works, and then that way you'll hopefully see the connection between that, multiplication, and our division problems. So we're first going to start with this example, but first we need to remind ourselves of a few vocab words. So that the first one is denominator. If you notice, the denominator is the bottom number of a fraction. The numerator is the top number of a fraction. So in the case of 1/4, the denominator is the 4 because it's on the bottom, and the numerator is the 1 because it's on the top of the fraction. So to make this a little less challenging, we're going to first find a common denominator that will make the fraction look a little less scary. So instead of trying to take 3 1/4 from a whole number, we're going to turn the whole number into a fraction. We do that by creating a improper fraction. So 6 in this case is equal to 24/4. We wanted the 4 to be the denominator so that it would match the other denominators in our question. So in this case we get 6 is equal to 24/4. Knowing that, we can then solve. 24/4 minus 3 1/4, so you do 24 minus 3 is equal to 21, and you just carry over the 4, and you get 21/4. So, from doing this example, we can see that repetitive subtraction is the same concept as division. It is not the same thing, it is the same concept, the same idea. Because when you are dividing, you are taking a bigger number and cutting it into certain amounts of a smaller number. This is also true for repetitive subtraction because we took 1/4 away 3 times. Does that make sense? Okay, so now knowing that, we're going to move on to the next section. So now we're going to look into the process of dividing fractions. For a lot of people, it may seem like a new scary idea because there are a lot of numbers involved that do not match up. So you may think that because 4, 2, 5, and 3 have nothing in common, or they're not all the same number, you may think it's impossible to have the numbers fit into each other. But let's get a common denominator so it's a lot less scary looking. So by finding a common denominator, we find that the common denominator in this case is 15. So when we multiply to get 15, we have to multiply by 3. So we do 4 times 3 and get 12. So 4/5 is equal to 12/15. We do the same thing on the other side of the problem, and we get 2/3 is equal to 10/15. And now we have the same denominator for the question. Now it's not as complicated looking because we have 2 numbers that are in common, but you may still question that 12 cannot be divided by 10, right? Well, this is where our new process comes in. And I want you to write down any notes, any questions you have at this point so that you can ask them at the end, or go ahead and ask them now. Any questions you have? Okay, let's move on. So now we're going to look at the process of dividing fractions. But first, we're going to make the entire concept easier by using a 3-step process that we're going to memorize throughout the year. So first, before we do this, we need to know what a quotient is. So in this case, a quotient is the answer to a division problem. Okay? So whenever we say 4/5 divided by 2/3 and we're saying find the quotient, we mean what is the answer to this question. So we're first going to watch a YouTube video to get an introduction to this process I mentioned. So we're going to do that now.
Want to divide fractions and you're confused. Don't worry, Instructor Beats has a strategy to use. Keep, change, flip is what we do. Use it every time, it will work for you. Keep the first fraction exactly the same. See the division sign and change its name. Flip the last fraction on top of itself. Now multiply and cross. Do it yourself. You gotta keep, you gotta change, you gotta flip, you gotta keep, change, flip, you gotta keep. You gotta change, you gotta flip, you gotta keep, change, flip.
The first fraction exactly the same. See the division sign, change its name. Flip the last fraction on top of itself. Now multiply across, do it yourself.
You gotta keep, you gotta change, you gotta flip, you gotta keep, change, flip, you gotta keep, you gotta change, you gotta flip, you gotta keep, change, flip, you gotta keep, you gotta change, you gotta flip, you gotta keep, change, flip, you gotta keep, you gotta change, you gotta flip, you gotta keep, change, flip.
Okay, so hopefully you all liked the video. Now we're going to move on to learning the actual process. So, like the video said, we're going to talk about the keep, change, flip method. Alright, so the 3-step system I mentioned makes dividing fractions very easy. So step 1 is to keep the first fraction and the problem the same. You're not changing anything about the first fraction at all. The second step is to change the division sign in the problem to a multiplication sign. This means that the division sign is going to become a multiplication sign. This now changes the problem from being a multiplication to a multiplication problem. So you're now going to look for a product, not a quotient. And remember, a product, right here, is the answer to a multiplication problem. So you're now changing the entire problem from division to multiplication, which you already learned and should be easier. The third step is to flip the second fraction in the problem. This means that the denominator becomes a numerator and the numerator becomes a denominator. When you're flipping a fraction, you are finding the reciprocal of that. So I do also want to mention that although we are changing the entire problem from division to multiplication, we will still get the same value because this method only changes the way we're going about it. It doesn't change the numbers, right? So we're still going to get the same value as you would dividing it anyway, okay? So our next section is we're going to practice flipping. So the most confusing part may be, why do we even flip the second fraction in the first place? So like I said before, we are getting the reciprocal of the fraction because we are flipping it. So whenever I say this, that means you're turning the numerator into the denominator and the denominator into the numerator. So you just see they're literally flipped upside down. So for the second example, we have 3 over 8. The 3 becomes the denominator and the 8 becomes the numerator, and it just flips around. It's not as hard as it seems. I know it sounded hard at first, but the more you get used to it, the easier it will become, okay? So do not worry about it. You've got it. So now we're going to start with example 1. So now that we know the steps, we're going to do some more practice. So for this one, we have 3/4 divided by 1/3. So for the first step, we're going to keep the left side the same. 3/4 stays the exact same. We're not doing anything to it. For the second step, we're going to change the division sign to a multiplication sign. So right here we have a division sign. Now we have a multiplication sign, right? So step 3, we're going to flip the second fraction. So the second fraction is 1/3. So instead of 1/3, we're going to flip it upside down and it becomes 3 over 1. So now we're going to just multiply across to get our answer, and we get 9/4 because 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 1 is 4, so we get 9 over 4. Now, I do want to note that this is an improper fraction. 9 over 4 is improper because the bigger number is on the top and the smaller number is on the bottom. Usually in normal fraction, the smaller number is the numerator and the larger number is the denominator. But it's improper or not usual because the larger number is on top and the bottom number is small. This is improper fraction, so write that down in your vocab sheet. Take notes if you want to. If you all want to write this down, go ahead and do so. And we're going to move on to our next section.